Hello, I'm Bridger Fates, and this is Year 4 or Level 2B of Youth Quality Assurance. This set of webinars is brought to you by the Youth Quality Assurance Zoom team of myself, Hudson Hill in Lincoln County, and Shar Perry in Lincoln County. So what is quality assurance? Well, by now you should have this one down pretty good. Quality. When we're talking about quality, we're talking about the meat and products that come from the animals that we're producing as 4-Hers. When we're talking about quality specifically here, we're talking about is the product safe and healthy, and is it good tasting? Is it flavorful? Is it tender? We're going to talk about tenderness later on in this presentation quite a bit, and those are sort of things that we're shooting for with quality. And assurance is a pledge or a promise to the consumers of the products that we're producing. So we're making this quality promise to consumers of the products that we're producing. So we're going to do a review, kind of figure out what you remember, and then we'll cover some new stuff at the end of this presentation as well. So first off on this review, why do we do proof of ownership? Or why do we do identification? Well, one, it's for proof of ownership. We can use it to record medications, and the more animals you have, the more important identification is to be able to properly record those medications. I mean, I know a lot of you as 4-Hers have 1 or 2 animals, and so your identification is to have them, give them names, right? So you know that you gave Bob a shot last week. But as you have more animals, it becomes even more important to properly identify them so that you can keep track of their records. It's also important in case somebody else needs to look at your records that they can look at that proper ID versus a name, because other people coming in to look at your animals wouldn't necessarily know their name, but they would be able to read their identification. It's also good management, right? We can keep track of things like weaning weights, average daily gain, and many more things with identification by utilizing that in our record keeping practices. There's 2 major types of identification. There's permanent and temporary. Permanent are identifications that cannot be removed. So things like brands, ear notches, tattoos, those are all permanent to the animal once they're placed on the animal. There's temporary things though too, like ear tags, brisket tags, ankle bands. Even electronic identification really falls in that temporary category. Things that can be removed from the animal. Another thing we need to review is reading that feed label. So what are we going to find on a feed label? Well, all purchase feeds will have a list of ingredients. You know, that's the main things that are, or that's what's in the feed. So things like corn, rolled oats, soybeans, those sorts of things. You're going to find that on the list of ingredients. You'll also find a feed analysis, which will tell you what the protein percentage is, what the fat percentage is, and other nutrient values so that you can figure out how efficient that is for feeding your animals. It'll tell you how much to feed. It'll tell you what animals you can and can't feed that feed to. And it gives you some manufacturer information. Some of the feeds that we use can be medicated, especially those of you who are feeding pigs. Generally, your grower ration is a medicated ration. And on those medicated feed tags, it will tell us what animals it can legally be fed to. It gives us the medication in the feed, and it gives us warnings and withdrawal times for that feed. So what's the withdrawal time? We've talked about this one for the last few years too. Hopefully you guys are picking up on this definition, but it's the time from when an animal receives a drug to when it can be harvested, or the milk can be used without having a drug residue. So oftentimes on our medicated feeds, it might tell us something like that this feed needs to be stopped being fed to the animal at least 2 weeks or at least 3 weeks prior to that animal being harvested. So it depends on the drug that you're using and the feed that you're using, but that withdrawal time will be a certain amount of time that that feed or a shot needs to be stopped before the animal is harvested. Residue or drug residue is the portion of the medication that may remain in the animal's body tissue. And so what we're really trying to do with this withdrawal time is minimize or completely remove any residue in the body tissue before that animal's harvested, so that we're not consuming any medications. In terms of feed, we want to use high quality feed. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go out and buy the most expensive feed you can afford, because sometimes very good high quality feed can be at an economic price point. And so that just means be cautious of your quality, not necessarily your price. And in terms of quality, you want to make sure it meets the nutritional needs. So animals have certain protein requirements throughout their lifetime, and you will have a protein percentage on your feed. So if you can study and learn about the protein requirements of your animal, and then look at the protein percentage on the feed and be able to determine whether you're meeting an animal's nutritional needs. Some other things with feed, obviously keep it clean, free of wire, manure, mold, etc. We want to keep all of those contaminants out of our feed if possible. We want to store the feed properly. So we want to keep it dry and clean. We want to keep it away from rodents and other animals as much as possible. And we want to make sure that it's not too old. So, feed does start to lose its nutrient value as we store it over time. And 2 to 3 months, you're probably just fine with a 4-H project. You wouldn't want to have a pig that you had 2 or 3 bags of feed left over when you got done with the pig that one year, and so the next year you pull out those old bags of feed and start feeding it again. No, that's probably not a good idea. Feed a year old like that, it's going to have lost nutrient value, and you'll have young pigs that really need high nutrient value in the feed. And then the other thing is, it tends to get moldy and other things over that year's time. So, 2 to 3 months is probably a good rule of thumb, and try not to store your feed longer than that. So what about water? Well, water might be the most important input that you give your animals. It's really important to keep good, clean, fresh water to your animals at all time. One of my 4-H'ers said last night that their family rule of thumb is if the water doesn't look like they'd like to drink it, then their animals probably don't want to drink it either. I think that's a good rule of thumb to have. Keep good, clean, fresh water that you'd be interested in drinking. They're not necessarily that you should drink it, but make sure it's clean and fresh looking, and your animals will appreciate that. Remember also that animals will die in 1 to 3 days without water. And we don't want to test this principle. We want to make sure that our animals have clean, fresh water every day. We don't want to see if they can last 3 days without water. That's definitely not a good idea. A shortage of poor quality water, a shortage or poor quality water will affect performance. Animals do not gain as much when they don't have good quality water. And the rule of thumb, how many gallons of water per 100 pounds? Do we remember that? It's actually 1 gallon of water per 100 pounds of body weight for animals when they're not stressed and when it's not too hot. So when it's cool outside and your animals are relatively unstressed, they need about 1 gallon of water per 100 pounds of body weight. Now, during fair time, a lot of our animals get stressed. It's hot during the summertime. And so in those periods of time, we need to really double that. And so up to 2 gallons of water per 100 pounds of body weight. So that means, a 150-pound lamb at fair time would need 3 gallons of water when it's hot outside. An 1,150-pound steer, at fair time needs about 23 gallons of water per day when it's hot and they're stressed. All right, now we're going to review some of the things about housing. So what do we remember about housing? Well, definitely with our pens, we don't want to overcrowd our animals. We want to keep the pens clean. We want dry bedding. That clean, dry bedding, especially in the wintertime or when it's cold, really can help keep our animals nice and warm and help protect our animals from getting sick. And so that's important. We don't want any nails or sharp objects sticking out in the pens. Not only can this be harmful for the animals, But those of you who have, pigs or steers or some of the larger projects, certainly when a pig gets up into the 200-pound range, most of you as kids are much smaller than 200 pounds. And if you're in the pen with your pigs, the pig is pushing you around, you're not pushing your pig around. And, our steers can definitely push us around too. And so we don't want sharp objects sticking out in our pens because if we get pushed around in the pen and pushed up against that sharp object, it can hurt us as well. So definitely keep those out, not only for the animal safety, but for our safety as well. We want to keep clean feed bunks and water, so if there's a lot of manure or other things that get in those feed bunks, clean them out once in a while. Make sure that they stay pretty clean so that the feed is good, clean feed that they're eating. And then again, with the water, clean, fresh water is really important. Feed bunks that are appropriate size. So especially, if you're feeding 3 or 4 animals together, you want to make sure that there is plenty of space for each of those animals to get in and feed at the same time so that they're not fighting over the feed. Now, it's a little different with some of your pigs because they are on self-feeders where they can access that feed at any time. So not every animal in the pen has to be able to eat at the same time, but a lot of our other projects, we're only feeding them once or twice a day, and really every animal needs to be in there and be able to eat at the same time. In terms of weather conditions, we want to try and protect from the extremes with our housing, right? So in the summer, we might want some shade, some fans, some misters. In the winter, definitely making sure we have good dry bedding, good straw, protection from the elements. So really protecting from those extremes for our animals in terms of our housing. Next thing we want to review is prevention. So some of you may remember doing a prevention activity where you looked at a potential problems that could occur if you were to go away for a week or two and needed somebody else to feed your animals. So in that prevention activity, we list things like what our vet number is, what feed we're feeding, how much feed to feed, which animals to get which feed, and all kinds of things like that, so that if someone came in and was going to take care of our animals for us while we were gone, that they'd be able to read that information and know how to properly take care of your animals. Some other important things in terms of prevention is teaching your family about quality assurance. So these things that you learn here in quality assurance, make sure your family that's helping you with your projects knows about these quality assurance things. Maintain your IDs so that those animals can be ID'd properly. Keep good records. Watch for signs of illness. That's really important to prevent illness before it gets too bad. It's much easier to doctor animals or help prevent illness than it is to treat animals once they get truly sick. And avoid contamination of feeds. All of these things can help us avoid danger zones. We need to really be careful with our animals and help prevent as many problems as possible. All right, let's learn about some animal handling principles now. And it's important to understand animals. There are differences in sight. They have a flight zone and they have a blind spot. And we're going to learn a little bit more about each of these here in just these next few slides. So cattle blind spot is right behind them, or animals blind spot. So not just, most of our ruminant animals like cattle, sheep, pigs, those that we would be using in our fair projects have similar blind spots, and that blind spot is right behind them. So they have a larger range of vision. They can see further behind them than we can as humans. We can really just see kind of out to the side, but they can see fairly good behind them, just not right directly behind them, as you can see on this chart. So their range of vision is from this arrow all the way around to this arrow, and the blind spot is just this blind spot here in the back. We also mentioned on that last slide that animals have a flight zone. So this circle represents a flight zone, and when you step inside that circle, an animal will first tense up and then start to move away. And it really depends on the animal how big their circle. Some animals, you know, wild animals, their circle is really, really large. For those of you who like to hunt, you might see this, right? When an animal sees you from a long ways away, they turn and move away or run off. And so their flight circle can be really big. Some of our domesticated animals, their flight circle is a little bit smaller, and it really depends on the individual animal as well, how big their flight circle is. When we think about flight zone, as a person moves into that comfort zone, it makes the animals tense and then move away. So we have this farmer here moving into the flight zone of this set of cattle, and you can see them as he moves into that flight zone, tensing up and then turning to move away. Some other key important differences in sight with our 4-H project animals, especially pigs, sheep, goats, and cattle, is their depth perception is different than ours. We have very good depth perception. We were, as early humans, it was important for us to be able to prey on other animals, to be able to capture animals, to feed ourselves. And so it was really important for us to be able to judge good depth perception so that we could do that. Animals like cattle, pigs, goats, those are animals that don't prey on other animals, but they were animals that potentially could get preyed on by things like wolves, coyotes, lions. And so it wasn't as important for them to develop good depth perception. They didn't need to know how far away the coyote was. They needed a good broad perception. So they can see a much broader perception than we can, but not good depth perception. So, and that helped protect them when they were wild animals, and they still maintain that as domesticated animals. But what does that mean for them? It means that they have a hard time seeing how far things are away. So in this example, these pigs here, on the one side, we have this slatted fence. It's really difficult for a pig to be able to see, especially if somebody's standing on the other side of the fence, if they're right next to that fence, or if they're in front of that fence. It's hard for them to be able to understand that. These solid sides, like this other side of this alleyway, is better for our animals, because they can the shadows, the changing in depth perception doesn't affect them as much with a solid surface. So how are all these related? Well, again, this circle is the flight zone that we talked about. Once you're inside of that, an animal is going to change its pattern. It's going to tense up and move away. The range of vision is from here all the way around to here. So they have a greater range of vision than we do as humans. And you can test this by putting your finger out to the side and trying not to move your head and seeing when you lose your finger. It's usually about up here on this circle. So our range of vision is much smaller than these animals. And then the blind spot. You can see that the circle is closer to the animal in the blind spot and further away from the animal out front. So that's really true. If you think about the flight zone, you can get closer to an animal from behind as long as that animal can't see you. But once it notices you, it will move away rapidly when you do that. So it's really better to approach it where the animal can see you and utilize that flight zone to begin to be able to understand how to handle and maneuver our animals. In terms of animal handling principles, cattle, swine, and sheep are herd animals. They like to be in a group if possible. They do not like to be alone. So when we're working with our animals, as much as possible, if we can work with them with other animals, that's important. And with our 4-H projects, as much as possible, if we can have other animals with our animal, they will do better in terms of feeding and gaining. So single animals left on their own don't tend to eat as much. They don't tend to do as well as animals in groups. It's really important to remember this. It's also important to remember as you separate your animal out to work with it, you know, to train it to drive if it's a pig, or or to lead if it's a steer, or to set up if it's a lamb. As you take those out individually, they are going to be a little bit more nervous and not be as comfortable working with them alone as they are in a group. So just be aware of that and be cognizant as you're working with your animals. All right, let's review some of the things we've learned about bruising over the last few years of workshops. Once an animal has been bruised, it can take 60 to 90 days for the bruise in the muscle tissue to heal. So we have to be really careful with our 4-H projects because a lot of times we're working with those animals clear up to 3 or 4 days before they're harvested. And so we need to make sure that we're careful and cautious and not bruising our animals as much as possible. This is the result of some bruising. This top picture shows an example of a bruise that had to be trimmed out of this beef carcass. You can see quite a bit of meat was lost from this beef carcass, and that's quite a bit of money that's lost from that beef carcass because it was a bruised animal. You can also see an example here of a bruise on this carcass in this bottom picture that has not been trimmed out yet, but it's going to have to be trimmed out. We're not going to be able to keep that bruised meat in there and sell that because no one wants to eat that bruised meat as a consumer. So some things not to do. We don't want to be yelling or screaming around our animals. We don't want to use electric prods. And we don't want to hit the animals with boards or other hard objects. All of those things can contribute to bruising and to stress on our animals. And we want to minimize that bruising and stress as much as possible. All right, so to get credit for this section of youth quality assurance, we need to answer these 5 questions. There will be 5 more questions come up towards the end of the presentation and then your assignment at the very end. But questions 1 through 5. So who is responsible for quality assurance? I think the best answer here for this question 1 is everyone, but also me as a producer. So I would say producers and everyone is the best response for question 1. So write down producers and everyone. All right. So everybody had a chance to write that one down? Okay, number 2, name a type of animal ID. So there were several that we talked about, right? There were ear tags, there were brisket tags, there were brands, there were tattoos, there were ear notches. So you can write down any one of those on number 2. So on number 2, pick one of those. Ear tag, brisket tag, tattoo, brand, and write that down for number 2. Number 3, list something you can find on a feed tag. So there were several things that we talked about you can find on a feed tag. And so there's several appropriate answers for this one as well. One might be the ingredients. One might be the feed analysis or nutrients. One might be if it's medicated feed. You can also find the manufacturer on the feed tag. You can find how much to feed your animals. So write any of those down for number 3. Ingredients, nutrients, how much to feed your animals, manufacturer, any of those work for question 3. All right, number 4, you got a 50% chance on this one. It's true or false. So withdrawal time is not important. Is that true or false? Well, that's false. Withdrawal time is important, especially with medicated feed or medications, to make sure that we're not having drug residue in our meat. So the answer to number 4 is false, right? False down. And then number 5, how many days can an animal go without water? The answer to this one is 1 to 3 days. So write down 1 to 3 days. But remember, we're not going to test to see if they can make it 3 days. We're going to keep clean, fresh water to them every single day. All right, so make sure you get those 5 answers written down for questions 1 through 5 so that you can get credit for this level of quality assurance. Okay, it's time to talk about a few new things now for this year. So all of that, whether you remember it or not, was review from previous years, but we're going to work on some new stuff now. One of the things we need to talk about is buckshot and birdshot. Doesn't happen often, and it's usually only in cull cows or bulls. It's very difficult to stop the problem at the packing plant. They have to retrieve all of the buckshot or birdshot if they find it in an animal, and cost increase when found by the processor or the consumer significantly. And I realize as 4-Hers, you're probably not, this probably isn't a problem. Not too many of you are getting buckshot or birdshot in your animals, but it's something to be aware of that can be a problem. And there's some things that we can do to help it. So we can monitor hunters, post no hunting signs, know who comes on your property, and move cattle or other animals to other areas so that they're not near hunters. So if you had a bird hunting area near your farm, you'd want to make sure that your animals were protected so that any stray buckshot or birdshot wouldn't get into your animals. And then as producers, never use shotguns to move your animals, right? This is one that even as 4-Hers, we know that's not the right thing to do. All right, so we've talked a little bit about bruising. We've talked about some buckshot and birdshot. Shar Perry and some of the Lincoln County 4-Hers are going to go through an example here with this pudding and teach us about some more details about bruising, buckshot, even broken needles, and what it might mean to consumers. So let's watch this short video with Shar.
About how we should be handling our animals, the importance of keeping our animal quality, our carcass quality high, not beating on them, not taking sticks. We want to treat them great. We want to have a good carcass. We're thinking quality assurance. So this next activity we're going to do goes along with quality assurance. So I have 6 puddings. I want you each to grab a pudding, and I want you to eat your pudding. How's your puddings? Good? All right, take another bite. Ooh, you just pulled a face. What was that face for? Oh, what did you just find in there?
Bean.
You got a bean in yours? What do you have in yours?
Rocks.
Oh, it looks like a little BB. Oh, a bean? All right. Anybody else find anything in theirs? Yeah, right. Okay, so what does your bean represent in our carcass quality?
Bruises.
A bruise, right? You have a nice big juicy steak and in the center there's a bruise. What happens to that? Do you want to eat that steak? No, it's hard. And that tenderness got affected all the way around that bruise from 3 inches out. So you got stew meat left over on the edge of your steak, right? Not a very good one. All right, what do you think yours represents in there? Okay.
Buckshot.
Buckshot, yeah. And those are actually edible. They're little candy that goes on cake. So if you want to eat them, you can.
Okay.
But it's buckshot. Sometimes when our cows are out on the range, we might need to make sure we post no hunting signs, right? If you get that in your hamburger and a steak, what are you going to think?
Ew.
Yeah, and they're not going to be edible, right? They're going to break your teeth out. So if that happens, that carcass is no longer any good, right? All right, was everybody else's pudding good? Yeah? So we should have had one with a needle in it. Oh no, right? What just happened? Who ate our needle? What happens if we consume a needle? Yeah, right? Not a good thing, right? So our needle was actually just a little piece of macaroni, a hard, crunchy macaroni. So it's not going to kill you. It might be in Bridger's because he got a little scared.
Yeah, I saw it.
Did you have a hard little thing in it? Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're giving our animal a shot and our needle breaks, what do we do? Yeah, right then and there, you get your pocket knife and see if you can get it out. If you can't get it out, what happens to that animal? Should I walk it around and try and get the vet?
No, because the needle is fine.
Right, it's a muscle, and that muscle contracts, and that needle's going to move through the muscles. So at that point, that carcass is no longer good, right? Or that animal will be it won't be good to consume. Great, thank you guys.
All right, we'd like to thank Shar and the 4-Hers from Lincoln County for teaching us a little bit more about bruises, buckshot, and even broken needles and how we don't want them in our products. All right, now let's talk about abscesses. So abscesses are areas of infection in the muscle tissue, and they may be filled with fluid. They may not be visible on the surface, so we might not know about them on the surface, but on a carcass, they must be cut out and thrown away. And abscesses, we're going to talk about how abscesses can be caused through improper injection sites or giving shots in the wrong place or too much medication in one spot on the animal. So it's really important that we're aware of this when we're giving our animals shots. Here's an example of an abscess. So this is an example here of this congealed material. You know, it gets in these large circles like this. It's not something you would want to eat in, to bite into. It's not pleasant. It's not something we like at all. We'll learn a little bit more about how each of these abscesses are caused. In this example, this is an example of the wrong location. So we didn't necessarily give too much medication in one spot. We just gave it in the wrong spot. We gave the shot in a muscle that we were going to be eating instead of doing it in the neck, which is the proper spot to give the medication to. These abscess examples are example of too much injected and in the wrong location. So there was too much vaccine given at one time there, you know, so it swelled up, it got inflamed, it's infected, and we have all this scar tissue remaining. We can see it here. So not only did we give too much where it caused those sorts of problems, but also it was put in the wrong spot. So it was given in an area where we were going to eat that steak, right? You can see this is a steak that this came off of. And you can see the part that's all swelled and infected and nasty, but there's this white area clear out around there too that is affected. And that affects the meat quality all the way around, clear to the outside of that white part on that meat. And we can see it down here too, how large that circle of affected area is from those improper injection sites. So abscesses are usually caused by improper injection procedures, and sometimes they occur even with proper injection procedures. And so one of the things that we need to make sure that we do is vaccinate our animals up here in the neck, in front of the leading edge of the shoulder. And the reason that we do that is so that even if we have an abscess created, this is an area where we're not consuming the meat from. We don't consume the meat from up here in the neck, and so we're not losing value in that carcass. And we want to use the neck, whether we're giving a sub-Q or an IM type of shot. So sub-Q stands for subcutaneous, which is just under the skin, and IM is intermuscular, which is a shot that gets given in the muscle. So in the muscle and under the skin is how you can remember those two different categories of sub-Q and IM. Let's talk about tenderness now. Tenderness is one of the most important attributes of meat. It is really, really important that meat is tender so that consumers will appreciate the product. I used to work for a genetics company, and we did some research on tenderness and looked at studies where meat that may not have been all that high quality, so it could be a select grade steak, as long as it was tender, when people took blind taste tests, they generally found that steak to be a favorable eating experience. Now, steaks that are even prime, if something was done in the cooking process or the handling process that made that steak tough, in the blind taste tests, even though it was a prime steak, if it was a tough steak, people found it to be an unpleasurable eating experience. So tenderness really is one of the most important values in an eating quality experience for meat. And abscesses and poor injection procedures can decrease meat tenderness. Another thing that can decrease meat tenderness is stressing our animals. So trying to keep our animals calm and put them under the least amount of stress is important. And then one other thing that can affect tenderness is significant weight reductions. So if we're forcing our animals to lose weight before fair, that can really impact the tenderness and meat quality of that animal. So we need to be really careful with how we manage an animal's weight, how we manage their stress level, and how we deal with abscesses. Tenderness is decreased in an area up to 3 inches away from the lesion in all directions. So if we have this injection site damage here, this yellow circle, up to 3 inches away in a circle all the way around that is going to be decreased. So that's 3 inches this way and 3 inches that way. That's 6 inches clear across that circle that we're going to have to remove from that animal because it's not going to be good product after that injection site lesion. If we look at top sirloin, this example again, this is that injection site. We can see that in this blue circle, all of that is affected and would not want to be consumed based on that meat quality. All right, so we've got 5 more questions to ask you and then a few review items. But number 6, and remember, we need to complete these questions to get credit for this round of quality assurance. So we need to write these down. 6, you got a 50% chance. So true or false, all animals have a flight zone. That answer is true. Now, some animals, their flight zone is very large, and some animals, it's very small. But all animals, especially all livestock animals that we're dealing with, have a flight zone. So that answer, number 6, is true. Number 7, do animals have good depth perception? So livestock animals do not have good depth perception. So the answer is no here. Now, other animals like predators, like bears, coyotes, humans, we do have good depth perception. But the answer to 7 is no, because we're talking about our livestock animals here. And number 8, do our livestock animals have wide or narrow vision? So the answer to number 8 is wide vision. They can see a broad spectrum, but they don't have good depth precision. So number 8 is wide. Number 9, name a cause of an abscess. So what are some of the things we just talked about that can cause abscesses? Well, certainly the one that we talked about the most were improper injection sites. So injection is the answer for number 9. So on number 9, you want to write down injection. And the last question, number 10, how far away from a lesion is tenderness decreased? Right, we just talked about this one too. So when you have an injection site lesion, what's the circle? How far away in inches is that decreased? And the answer is 3 inches, right? 3 inches from all directions. But on number 10, if you'll just write down 3 inches, that's the answer. All right, do we have the answers for 6 through 10? It's important so that you can pass this level of quality assurance. So some summary items. Animal handling and carcass quality are closely related. Stress and bruises causes poor meat quality. So we want to be aware of that when we're handling our animals and be as careful with our animals as we can. Animal handling principles like sight, flight zone, and blind spot are important when we're handling our animals so that we can handle them properly, reduce the amount of stress, be able to get our animals to move in the directions and how we want them to move. Remember that animals are herd animals. That livestock are herd animals. They like to be in herds. And so when we separate them out, that causes extra stress. And we can reduce a lot of issues by remaining calm ourselves. So not getting excited, yelling, screaming, those things are important for us. And then your final assignment here. We want to complete the animal handling assignment by filling in the requested information. So there's a table that you'll have, and you just have to label that with the correct word, and we'll have those words for you. This is an activity that we've done a lot with youth. So complete this table, and then after completing it, return it to the extension office to receive credit for passing this level of quality assurance. Well, I hope you've learned some more about how to treat your animals, how to give proper injections, how to manage them in terms of their blind spots, their flight zones, all of that good stuff. I hope that you've gotten some more out of this and continue to learn better youth quality assurance practices. Would like to thank the Zoom team of myself and Hudson Hill and Shar Perry for these videos, and we'll see you back next year for our final Zoom presentations. Thank you.